The scent of ozone and wet pavement always reminds me of the day my reality fractured. I am Julian, a man who once believed that wealth was a shield and silence was a form of peace. My life was anchored by two people: my wife, Elena, a woman of ethereal grace, and my father, Silas, the patriarch of the Blackwood dynasty. We lived in a world of polished mahogany and whispered secrets, but I never suspected that the loudest secret was being kept in my own master suite. It was a Tuesday when the central servers at my investment firm crashed, granting me a rare afternoon of freedom. I drove home, intending to surprise Elena with a trip to the coast. But as I turned onto our private drive, I saw it, my father's silver sedan, tucked away under the weeping willows 3 houses down. Silas was a man of absolute ego. He never hid unless he was hunting. I entered the house through the service door. The air inside was heavy, vibrating with a low, rhythmic hum, a melody Silas used to whistle when he was closing a deal. I followed the sound up the grand staircase, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Outside our bedroom, the door was slightly ajar. I didn't find them in a state of disarray. What I saw was far more haunting. They were sitting on the edge of the bed, their foreheads pressed together in a silent, agonizingly intimate prayer. Their fingers were interlaced with a familiarity that suggested years, not months, of closeness. When I pushed the door open, they didn't startle. Elena looked at me with a chilling, clinical relief, as if she had been waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act. Silas stood up with the predatory grace that had made him a legend in the boardroom, calmly suggesting we move to the library to discuss our future like civilized men. In the library, surrounded by the leather-bound books of my ancestors, they laid out a proposal so grotesque it felt like a business merger. They admitted they had been soulmates long before I met Elena. Silas had discovered her first. They claimed their connection was a cosmic inevitability, and for the sake of the family's social standing and Silas's upcoming political appointment, they proposed a mature solution. I would remain legally married to Elena, preserving the image of the perfect Blackwood heir, while they continued their life together behind closed doors. They offered me financial freedom and a discreet life of my own, provided I kept the secret. They weren't asking for my forgiveness. They were inviting me to be a silent partner in my own betrayal. I didn't scream. I simply walked out into the rain, leaving my keys on the table, knowing that a house built on such a foundation had to burn. I sought refuge in a place Silas couldn't reach, a cluttered basement office belonging to Elias, a man the world knew as a disgraced cop, but I knew as my only friend. Elias was the antithesis of the Blackwood polish. He was rugged, cynical, and obsessed with the truth. When I told him about the mature solution, he didn't look surprised. He looked hungry. He had been waiting for a crack in the Silas armor for a decade. Within 48 hours, Elias had bypassed the encryption on Elena's private cloud storage, and what he found turned my heartbreak into a cold, focused rage. Elena wasn't just a girl I'd met at an art gallery. She was the daughter of Marcus Thorne, Silas's former partner, who had disappeared in a tragic boating accident 20 years ago. Elias showed me a digital folder, labeled the Obsidian Initiative. It contained a series of contracts and internal memos showing that Silas hadn't just lost a partner. He had eliminated one. Marcus had been on the verge of exposing a massive embezzlement scheme within the family firm. After his death, Silas had used Victor Vance, a ruthless attorney who acted as the family's cleaner, to bury the evidence and absorb Marcus's shares. But the most devastating revelation was Elena's role. She hadn't come for revenge. She had come for a payoff. She had approached Silas 3 years ago with proof of his crimes. And instead of going to the police, she had made a deal. She would marry me to ensure Marcus's shares stayed within the family trust, preventing any external audits. And in exchange, Silas would make her the wealthiest widow in the state once I was dealt with. The dealing with me part was detailed in a thread of emails between Elena and Victor Vance. They weren't planning to kill me. That would be too messy for a man with political aspirations. Instead, they were documenting my increasingly unstable behavior. Elena had been microdosing my evening tea with a cocktail of hallucinogens and sedatives, preparing a medical trail that would allow them to have me committed to a private psychiatric facility. Once I was declared unfit, Silas and Elena would assume total control of my mother's estate, the only part of the Blackwood fortune Silas couldn't touch due to a strict prenuptial agreement my mother had signed before her own sudden death. I realized then that I wasn't just a cuckolded husband. I was an obstacle in a multi-generational heist. The investigation took an even darker turn when Elias recovered a suppressed autopsy report from my mother's passing 10 years ago. The official cause had been a heart arrhythmia, but the private report, hidden in Vance's dead man files, showed traces of the same sedative Elena was currently using on me. My mother had found out about the Obsidian Initiative, and Silas had used the same playbook on her. The realization shattered the last remnants of my soul. My father was a serial predator who used marriage as a cage and love as a poison. Elias confessed that his own father had been the lead detective on Marcus's disappearance, only to be framed for corruption by Victor Vance when he got too close to the truth. We weren't just two men looking for evidence. We were two sons seeking a reckoning for our parents. We spent the next week playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse. I returned to the estate, pretending to be the broken, drugged-out husband they expected. I watched through the smart home cameras. Elias had hacked as Silas and Elena met in the library, discussing the final transfer of funds. Victor Vance was there, too, his voice oily as he explained how they would move $40 million to a shell company in the Cayman Islands the night of the founders' dinner. They thought I was upstairs, lost in a chemical fog. In reality, I was in the basement, recording every word, every laugh, and every admission of guilt. Elena was even more cold-blooded than Silas. She suggested that once I was in the institution, they should accelerate my decline to avoid any future legal headaches. The final piece of the puzzle came from a burner phone Elias intercepted. It was a message from Vance to a local judge, confirming a donation in exchange for an expedited commitment order for me, dated for the morning after the dinner. They had everything timed to the second. They were going to celebrate their victory at the most prestigious event in the city, while I was being hauled away in a straitjacket. But Silas had forgotten one thing. He had raised me to be just like him, calculating, patient, and ruthless when backed into a corner. I spent my nights not in a stupor, but in a tactical trance, preparing a gift for every guest at the founders' dinner that would ensure the Blackwood name would never be spoken again. Without a shudder, the night of the founders' dinner arrived with a deceptive calm. The ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold, filled with the city's elite, the very people Silas needed to impress for his political campaign. My father was in his element, holding a glass of vintage champagne. Elena draped on his arm like a trophy. She wore a dress the color of a bruise, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of my instability. I arrived late, dressed in a tuxedo that felt like armor. When I walked in, the room went quiet. I looked shaken, my tie slightly crooked, playing the part of the crumbling heir to perfection. Silas approached me, his hand landing on my shoulder with the weight of a silk-covered mallet, whispering that I should go home before I made a scene. I didn't go home. I walked to the podium during the keynote speech. The silence was absolute as I opened my leather briefcase. I didn't give a speech. Instead, I signaled Elias. Suddenly, the massive LED screens behind me, meant to show a campaign video for Silas, flickered to life. But it wasn't a campaign video. It was the high-definition footage of Silas and Elena in the library, discussing the murder of my mother, the disposal of Marcus Thorne, and the plan to drug me. The audio was crystal clear, Silas's voice bragging about how he had cleansed the family of Marcus's weakness. The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of gasps and dropped glasses. I began distributing the dossiers Elias and I had prepared, physical copies of the suppressed autopsy and the bank transfers, orchestrated by Victor Vance. I watched as the mask of the statesman slid off Silas's face, replaced by the raw, animalistic fury of a cornered beast. He lunged for me, shouting that he would destroy me. But he stopped when he saw the men entering through the back doors. They weren't local police. They were federal agents Elias had coordinated with for weeks. Victor Vance tried to slip out through the kitchen, but he was met by the sheriff, the son of the man whose career Vance had ruined. The friends Silas had spent decades buying off stood frozen, their loyalty evaporating the moment they realized the Blackwood ship was underwater. But the final twist came from the woman I had called my wife. As the agents moved to cuff Silas, Elena stepped forward, her face a mask of sudden, frantic innocence. She pulled a small digital drive from her locket and handed it to the lead agent, claiming she had been an undercover witness all along, that she had married me only to gather evidence against the man who killed her father. It was a brilliant, desperate play for immunity. She looked at me, her eyes begging me to play along, to save her so we could share the spoils of the war. But I simply looked at her and nodded to Elias. On the screens, a second video began to play, the recording of Elena and Vance planning my accidental overdose in the asylum. It proved she wasn't a witness. She was a co-conspirator who had outgrown her master. The fallout was a beautiful, scorched earth victory. Silas was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and racketeering. He would die in a cell, stripped of his titles and his pride. Victor Vance took a plea deal that involved disbarment and a decade in prison, turning state's witness against everyone he had ever protected. Elena, despite her insurance policy, was charged as an accessory after the fact and for the attempted poisoning of a spouse. She lost everything: the money, the status, and the Marcus Thorne shares she had coveted so much. The estate was seized. But because I had used my mother's protected funds to buy the land years ago, I was able to reclaim the house after a grueling 6-month legal battle. I returned to the Blackwood estate one last time, not to live there, but to burn the memories. I stood in the foyer, the silence no longer oppressive but liberating. Elias was there, finally holding the file that cleared his father's name. We didn't celebrate. We simply stood in the wreckage of a dynasty. I repainted the walls, sold the mahogany furniture, and cleared the weeping willows that had once hidden my father's car. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was a jagged path of reclamation. I am no longer the man who accepts silence as peace. I am the man who knows that the truth is a fire. It destroys everything in its path, but it leaves the ground clean for something real to grow. I drove away from the estate as the sun set. The Obsidian legacy finally buried where it belonged, in the past.